Innotribe, please welcome Senior Principal, Collective Next, Hamilton Ray.
Thank you. So welcome to the last Innotribe session of the day. We're delighted to have all of you here. You guys can keep coming on in. So we are here to talk about disruption, and not in the academic way, but in the real world way. And we've got some experts here to tell us about it. So I'm going to go ahead and invite them up to the stage. So first of all, we have the Executive Director of the Sorensen Center for Discovery and Innovation at the University of Utah, Chris Wasden. Chris, back to the stage. Thank you. We also have, he's well-deserved, round of applause. We also have filling in for, you saw Hayden Shaughnessy on Skype. We wanted someone live to talk about it, so filling in for Hayden, we have Peter Vander Awara. He is the renowned sense maker and the co-founder of Innotribe. So all of this came from Peter's brain at some point. So a round of applause for Peter. And finally, gamely joining us, the President Europe of Earthport, Dan Marovitz. Come on up, Dan. All right. Thanks, Dan.
I promise innovation doesn't have to hurt. Disruption can be pain-free, but not for me today.
Yeah. All right. So in our last session, Zen and Kapran took us through a wormhole to the year 2020, and we're going to stay there. So for all of you, we're in the year 2020 in this spaceship, this time machine, and we're going to look at real-world disruption scenarios. And so Chris and Hayden have done research on disruption, and Chris is going to tell you a little bit about the project overall, and then he's going to kick it off telling us about some key drivers. Some key drivers of disruption. So, Chris.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. For the last year, we've been working with Innotribe and Peter to try to understand what does the world in 2020 look like. To do that, we used some common scenario techniques where we said, let's identify those forces that are currently in place that we don't think are going to change at all. Therefore, we can consider those things to be rock solid. Let's look at some things that are emerging also in the financial services industry that we think are key drivers to drive us towards the 2020 future. Then let's identify some things that are wild cards, things that could happen, we don't know, but would completely throw everything topsy-turvy, and create these scenarios of the future that then help us know from a SWIFT and a financial services industry perspective, if the future looks like this, what should we do as far as creating strategic options for the future and making investments into a portfolio of real options that we could then exercise as these different futures emerge. When we looked at these four forces that we thought were rock solid that really weren't going to change, we identified one as being regulators are de facto disaggregating banks. Regulation today is forcing banks, not in an explicit way, but in an implicit way, to really start to break apart in ways that we haven't seen in the past. We see SMAC technologies. SMAC technologies are social, mobile, analytic, and cloud technologies, now disaggregating banks as well. So it's not just a regulatory threat, but it's actually a technology threat that's forcing disaggregation of the banking industry. With that, we also looked at how other industries were impacted by similar sorts of change. And we looked specifically at Kodak as a case study because we wanted to see what would it mean to have a Kodak moment in the financial services industry. And what we found is there are some great lessons that we learned about Kodak moments, about what we would need to do to avoid that sort of disruption we can go into later. And then finally what we saw is these new market entrants, these new digital disruptors that we see coming in the market are cherry picking the best, the most profitable, the most interesting businesses from the banks with the idea of leaving the banks with everything else that nobody wants. And so how does that really play out in the future? So with that, we then identified 6 drivers. And these 6 drivers we want you to pay attention to because we're going to ask you to vote on which of the 6 you think are going to be the most important in driving the future 2020 of the banking industry. The first is government and consumer-driven innovation. We've seen in the UK and in the US the government is increasingly trying to drive the banks towards innovation and towards new payment models. Part of this is because consumers vote. And consumers are saying to regulators and to governments, I'm having this type of a digital experience with Amazon or with Apple or with Google. Why can't my bank be the same way? If Amazon can deliver me a package in 24 hours, why does it take my bank 2 days to clear the money? I want to have the same experience in every part of my life, including banking, that I have in the other parts of my life. Consumers rather than customer-driven. Increasingly, your customers are being consumer-driven. And so increasingly, the banking regulations are not going to be driven by what you do to focus on your customers, but how you focus on that end consumer as well, and following what the end consumer wants as far as value. As consumers in a digital world, we experience a fairly friction-free world. We eliminate time as a constraint, location as a constraint. We can shop 24/7, 365 from any location in the world, and again, receive our products almost instantaneously. We want the same friction-free life in banking. Ubiquitous transactions. Ubiquitous transactions is more than just being able to do things mobily. It's saying, I don't even need to have a bank account to transfer money. All I need is an email address or a phone number, and that's all that's required to do a ubiquitous bank transaction in any currency, in any location around the world. Transparent and secure. You've oftentimes heard the phrase that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Increasingly, sunlight or transparency is going to be that which ensures security and privacy in ways that we've never had before. We see this going on with blockchain already, and we see transparency and security now being brought together to really drive change. And finally, banking, like many other highly regulated industries, feels oftentimes that they're somewhat immune to very disruptive changes because it's so highly regulated, the regulators aren't going to allow it. But if you believe the first driver, then what you also have to believe is the last one, which is that change is going to be continuous and deliberative. It may not be as fast in banking as it was in media, but it will continue relentlessly, and we will change the world, and regulators will actually be behind it and be driving it as well. So with that, we'd like you now to take your devices out and to do a vote as far as which of the 6 you think is the biggest driver for change in financial services. Voting is open. So this is really consistent with what we've seen in previous sessions today about the new digital disruptors, the Googles, the Amazons, the Alibabas, the Tencents, the Baidus, that are really driving change, whether it be in China or in the United States or globally from that perspective, and also this point about the government enabling and driving the consumer change as well. So with that, what we'd like to do now is we're going to have you all involved in a live activity. We're going to hand out some sheets here. And what we want you to do is look at all the names along this board and tell us, who do you think are the winners, who do you think are the losers, and why in this new world?
Great. So, Chris, if I may, so we're going to ask you that even though this is year 2020, we still have papers and pens here. We're going to ask you guys to cluster into groups of 4 or 5. Make some new friends, especially get even friendlier there in the back as you guys are crammed in. And we're going to hand out some templates that look like this. And just to build on what Chris said, we're going to ask you, first of all, either one of these companies or a company that maybe we didn't mention in the year 2020. We see this company benefiting the most from disruption because they can leverage their capabilities. And tell us what those capabilities they are that you think will lead them to win based on which drivers. So one, pick a winner. If you were to place a bet on who's going to win in this new economy in 2020, who is it? And also, who's going to lose? Right, is there a company up here that you think will be the biggest loser in 2020 because of those drivers? So form yourself into a group just so you have a chance to talk with each other. Mary here in green and Gretchen are going to walk around with some templates. So hold up your hand when you have your group, and we'll hand you a template. So we got some here. This is activities. Gretchen, Evan, just hand them out. Make sure the people in the back get some. Yep. All right. You guys look like you're a team that's waiting to happen. Here you go. Here's a template for you. All right, let's make sure we get some in the back, too. Yep, we got people waving in the back, Mary. They're waving their hands in the back.
We got some eager groups at the back here, Ham.
Yep.
Yeah,
We're on our way back.
Very enthusiastic at the back.
All right. So we're going to give you guys 5 minutes to do this activity. And who do you think's going to win? And who do you think's going to lose? And why? Go.
I know who you want to lose big time.
Any big bank, yeah.
Ben has one, I have one. I think they're only the two. So, okay, sounds good. So I'll cover this area. Do you have
Ben's got one.
Did you want me to? Because actually,
I have the one. I'm going to pass one on this side. Somebody else needs to pass on this side.
okay, so I'll get that.
Okay.
Postcards in here too, right?
Sorry, what?
Haydn's postcard
Yes, they're going to distribute them as people leave.
as they leave.
Yes. Yep. I told him.
Thanks.
To use this.
Personally.
All right, you've got about 2 minutes left. 2 minutes left. Make sure you fill out your templates.
So just whenever I start passing it, he's going to activate it.
Mary, are you covering from here so that just so I know?
I'll cover like this half of the room.
So
Do you
I'll
want to
cover
take that half?
all of this half here, yeah.
Back.
All right, you got about 20 seconds left to place your bets on the winners and the losers in 2020. All right. All right. So we want to do a quick report out just to see how aligned we may be, see what all you guys are thinking. And let's start, if you don't mind, with who you think is going to lose so that we can end on something positive as we move forward. So we'll start with losers. Who do you think maybe won't win as much? Maybe that's a little nicer in the 2020. But who are some of the losers in 2020, and who would like to share? Anybody? We've got mics here, so raise your hand. We'll come to you. Here we go, right here, brave first share. Who do you got?
The loser would be Western Union
Western Union. Why?
because primarily they are a single product business right now and there are cheaper and faster alternatives available in the market. And right now itself there are banks and there are platforms which give you much faster access to your funds at a much lower cost.
So they're a single product and there's others that are just faster and better. Yep. Who else? Anybody else have Western Union as a loser? Oh, whoa. Oh, I hope they don't have a booth here. Great. Were there any other? Who else? Who else has ones that you feel like is a pretty sure bet is not going to succeed in 2020? Who'd like to share? Anybody in the back? Come on, we'll pick on you if you don't want to share.
So Western Union is the only loser. Is that what we're hearing?
Who had somebody besides Western Union? Show of hands. All right. Let's hear it in the back. Sorry.
There we go. I was going to say, it's not a very good answer because we thought there were quite a few up here that had single plays.
Yeah.
It was a single idea, a single play. So, yeah, Western Union's one, but we were also looking at quite a few of the others.
So single play companies will not succeed in the future.
It was the risk.
They'll be
It
the
was a
losers.
risk, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. But how about right here? Can we? Thank you, Mary. Yep.
Well, basically, that answer goes to our winners somehow. We are saying that companies with a single business model will not survive. Companies that have a multiple business model will survive. That's why in the winners, we are also saying that none of them will be winners because all of them somehow have a unique business model. So which of these will evolve in a distributed autonomous corporation or a distributed autonomous organization? So I think that the companies, we are yet to see.
Got it. So as they stand now,
Yeah.
you don't think any of these companies would be winners in the future. They've got to evolve.
They will have their market share, that's definitely.
Sure.
But a winner, the Googles or the Amazon for the next...
Yeah.
So one thing to ask about your statement, if we look at Google, we call them a winner today, 98% of their revenues come from one business model. So you can become a pretty big company and pretty successful on one business model, if it's a good one.
But that business is being challenged right now with this distributed...
Right, after 20 years,
Yeah.
right?
Okay, but we are seeing the future here, right?
Right?
Yes.
Right.
Any other losers? Any other losers for a different reason here in the back? Yeah?
Well, we thought Bitcoin is going to be the big loser.
Who?
Bitcoin.
Bitcoin.
Yep. And why?
Well, first to compare last year Sibos, we heard a lot about Bitcoin. Now it's the first time we hear about Bitcoin. Everybody talks about blockchain, right? And more concretely, we believe it's just because of the compliance and maybe their business model, which is not sustainable anymore.
Yeah,
Okay.
So their technology is a winner, perhaps, but not the company itself.
Their
That's what you're
business
saying?
model is not sustainable, is what you said.
Yeah.
Did anybody else have Bitcoin?
Yeah, over there they did.
Yeah? All right. Let's flip it around. Who are the winners? And so we talked about what might characterize some of the winners already. Who picked the sure winner of this list up here, or maybe someone who's not up here? Certainly someone did. Bernard. Yes.
Alibaba.
Alibaba.
Yeah.
Yeah? Why? I think we all have a strong feeling, but what did you guys talk about?
Huge scale in every direction.
So moving in all the right directions. Did anybody else have Alibaba? Yeah?
Yeah, a lot.
A lot. Who had somebody else? Who'd be willing to share someone else? Right down here in the front. Great.
Baidu,
Baidu. And why?
because the big data potential what they have.
Big data?
Yep.
Yeah. Anybody else have Baidu?
Anyone have a non-Chinese company that's a big winner?
Yeah, there in the back. All right. Who'd you have?
Hi there. So we had Apple and Google as well, because very deep pockets, very good revenue streams, can afford to test, try, and fail many times and still be at the front. So we thought, they're still going to be around.
They're still going to be around. And have the mindset of the companies who are willing to explore new spaces.
And also, we thought that if any of the others become successful, Apple or Google will buy them.
Right.
Right.
That's a fair play. Anybody else have Apple and Google, or couple there in the back? All right, so a lot of Alibaba, some Apple and Google, some others. Any other comments on sort of what you saw here, Chris, before we move on?
No, I think we've kind of got, what you're going to see as this hour rolls on is that a lot of these views that you have are going to reemerge again and again.
Yeah.
And we're going to share with you 2 scenarios that we've created that will really play into some of what you're already thinking is going to be the future.
Great. So before we get into scenarios, we have a comment there in the back, real quick. Can we show a mic? Ben, can we give her a mic? Real quick.
Not necessarily representing the whole group, but there's an argument to be made for Big Bank X as well.
Yeah, and why?
Because in 1943, after about 50 years of the non-bank sector pioneering consumer finance, the banks decided it was a profitable business, and they colluded with the government to put usury laws in that put basically JCPenney's and the non-bank financials out of business.
Chris, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when you look at our top and our bottom drivers, they were government related, right? So I think this being a highly regulated sector, it depends on what side the government's on. And is the government going to collude, like you mentioned in the 40s and 50s, with the banks to help them, or is the government really going to be on the side of the consumer this time around digital revolution, because that's more consistent with digital revolution we've seen in every other industry. And so are the banks going to be the bad guys in this next round as opposed to the good guys that we're trying to stop usury before? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, but once it's built, then the banks may be in the best place to actually distribute. So it wouldn't, I'm not in favor of banks. I'm not in favor of anybody, but I'm just saying that's sort of the ideal way for government to choose its sides.
All right.
So kind of as a channel partner?
All right. So before we get into the scenarios that Chris just mentioned, we're going to have Peter talk about scenario thinking in general and how that played into the research that Chris mentioned. And not just scenario thinking, but also how you explore options and how you embrace the unexpected. So with that, Peter, I'll hand it over to you.
In the team that has been working on this piece of research with Innotribe, we had a lot of discussions, I would call it, whether scenario thinking or options thinking was the right thing to do. So I would like to use a quote. It's sometimes better to have discussions than to have arguments. Arguments is about somebody wanting to be right, and discussions is to find out the right answer, right? So I think it's a semantic discussion whether we discuss scenarios or options thinking. Because if we go back to the original scenario thinking that most of you may be familiar from Shell, the oil company, the whole thing was not only to look at probable scenarios, but also to look at uncertainties and things that most probably will not happen, and dare to go in-depth analysis in what would happen in such a scenario. So the way how I try to visualize this, and I have the almost impossible task to translate what Hayden Shaughnessy is writing and thinking about him, so he's much better than I am, so I'm trying to put it in my own words. So this is a way to think about scenarios. You have a certain direction in your company, and you say, and this is something that many of us are very good at, is to focus on the core. Yeah? Let's focus on the core and let's define some adjacencies of possible scenarios that we may evolve with our core. Yeah. But it's not only core related. So if we would think about options, it's about new highways of thinking that we start to develop. And there is some sense in this slide which is about horizontal expansion. So Hayden has a fantastic slide which is about horizontal expansion, where you see the evolution where newcomers are starting to attack the hegemony of big players and suddenly get into a horizontal expansion, like Google getting into cars or Amazon getting into logistics, etc., etc., etc. So you will see this as a common theme, that probably some of the players of tomorrow will be those who have the potential not only to enable transactions and stay in the core. So it's about not only about enabling transactions, but it's going to become about enabling commerce. And the transaction will just be a given of doing that commerce. We have seen today a lot of conversations about the future which are technology driven. We had this morning this overflow session about blockchain and distributed ledger, etc. I think what we have to do is to look at what the changed customer needs are. Yeah? I think we live in an illusion that the technology is going to change and disrupt. I think it's existing customer needs that are changing, that are going to disrupt. And Hayden has, in the previous session about China, enumerated a number of them. And it's really about customer needs changing and landing into many, many, many options horizontally. Many at the executive level don't see or don't want to see the many options because they are being trained to think in limited number of options. So let's see at the options, let's reduce it to 3 or 4, and let's then make a plan and hire some of the big fives and make a big plan around 1 or 2 or 3 of those options. But in the bottom of the organization, you have the younger generation. They see all the options. And the real challenge is an intergenerational challenge of people, how those many, many options become visible at the top. They are trained by their MBA courses to try to reduce options and therefore reducing risks. This is, I think, a very good example of something that you cannot plan for with scenario thinking that is not looking into uncertainties. Who would have thought that a fraud with testing systems would announce the demise of the diesel engine? Who would have thought that file sharing would announce the demise of music distribution? Who would have thought that Kodak would have been disrupted by the digital camera? By the way, that's a flawed story. Kodak did see the disruption coming. Kodak was in 2005 an absolute world leader in digital cameras. What Kodak killed was they got attacked in their core business of wet film by Fuji. And they didn't have the discipline to look into real options and try to explore those real options in real world environments, not in a lab, but in real world environments. So they were the world leader in technologies like OLEDs, but they have been taken over by Samsung, who is now the world leader in OLED screens. Hayden has produced what he calls the Wheel of Fortune. And I'm going to walk you through this wheel on a number of characteristics that we see in changing customer needs. Most of the things that you see here are not technology changes, it's changes in customer needs. And we'll start on the right-hand side with SME growth. If you listen to Hayden's story about China, you have noticed that we see more and more SMEs taking a bulk of the international trade. And those SMEs are becoming really multinational SMEs and eating away from the market share of multinational, Western multinational companies. So we are starting to talk about emerging multinational SMEs that are eating away share and creating a bulk of the traffic in the system. Although those SMEs, they have a high cost for payments, whether they do it through credit cards or other means, going from 3% to 8%, they don't take that anymore, and they want to find a cheaper, more frictionless way of making those payment transactions. Large enterprises, as I said, are getting outcompeted by those new emerging multinational SMEs. And large enterprises are getting pushed also by governments to start looking into platforms, and we see more and more vertical platforms emerging. Here are a couple of examples of emerging platforms. So I'll click through this. Here are a couple of emerging platforms. You could do it in a two-dimensional big 4, big 5 slides. Public-private platforms, one to many, many to many. But you see at this moment, many of those platforms are very vertically oriented. There is one for retail, there is one for health, there is one for global trade services. And you see a couple of players like SAP with Ariba Pay that are really starting to offer a full portfolio of services to do commerce, to do supply chain, and trade, and finance, and payment, and even FX is getting woven in as part of that offering. And I mean, I remember a time that, I think it was 5 years ago, that Dan said, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but you said something like, we were talking about personal data at the time, and you said something like, it's all about the digital slipstream of the transaction. Yeah? So the transaction is the payment transaction, and all the digital slipstream of data that you collect about behavior of customers in that transaction. I think we are starting to see a tipping point where it's almost the payment becoming the slipstream of the commerce, right? So I think the one-liner that one of the one-liners that we are going to end is, we are moving from enabling transaction to enabling commerce, is a very, very profound insight in what's going on at this moment. Let's go back to that wheel of fortune and continue the ride. So those large enterprises need more cash visibility. They don't need payments, they need cash visibility. They need DLT, but they don't need DLT, distributed ledger. What the real story is, they need real time. They need real-time payment, real-time settlements. That's what's driving the customer needs. And I think that Bitcoin and distributed ledger and blockchain are symptoms of that customer need. We see it now in payments, we see it coming up in securities, we see it coming up in FX. And some of those China platforms that we have seen in the earlier session are starting to profile themselves as real first-class pioneers in this real-time environment. There is one more dimension in this wheel of fortune. It's a self-fulfilling circle. So those platforms become more powerful, the SMEs have more power to grow, etc., etc. And you go back and back. It's almost like, what you call it? A virtual cycle, like the water is going into your bathtub. It takes you in. So I think some of the key points here are about real options and strategic options. We have discussed a long time how we could present this. So this is an example from the agricultural business. This is a company that is producing specialized sprinkler systems for agriculture. That's their core business. That's their strategic option number one. And how we could think about these level 1 options is, what if we would go into urban landscaping? Just look at this building and the Marina Sands Bay Hotel, just how much sprinklers you need there in an urban real estate environment. You're talking to a completely different sort of market, a completely sort of different buyers. So within that single level 1 options, you have a lot of other underlying options that you could do. You have to look into a completely different ecosystem that you have to work with. It's like professional buyers versus agricultural buyers. You have to align with Internet of Things standards. You have to attempt to be the standard in that market, etc. And so you can have multiple of those level 1 options, so going urban or in home or in fully automated systems with all those level 2 options around it. And I think the point that we are trying to make together with Hayden and the team that has worked on this research it's not enough anymore to do experiments in the lab. It's not good enough anymore to think about minimal value propositions or minimal value options. The point is to do real world experiments, not in the lab, but with real customers, with real ecosystems, with real partners, and looking at the capabilities that you as an organization have to develop. The word capabilities is again a very profound element in our research. You see a lot of benchmarks about innovation, about whether it's banks or other organizations, and what those benchmarks usually do, they measure the efficiency of your innovation process to produce a certain output. So it's a very output-oriented. So the output can be number of products shipped, or it can be impact on the ROI, or impact on the stock price, but it's very output-oriented. And it basically measures the past. What I think is very refreshing in Hayden's thinking is that he's benchmarking companies now on the input of innovation, which are the capabilities that organizations have to develop to succeed in this 21st century. And there are 5 categories of capabilities. Some of them are platform related, but some are related to leadership. Some are related to being able to exploit the whole information layer. So there's a lot of that material that we have now published on the Innotribe site about the Innovation Capability Index. We just have published, following the last session of here, the session about China and what's happening there. We have another paper that we have published on millennials and on women in the industry, how they change the business. I think that's where I left it. Yep. Those are some elements of the research. So it's not anymore about the lab. It's in real-world life scenarios. And if you know your options well, then uncertainty becomes your competitive advantage and not something to be afraid of.
Great.
With that, I get
Thank
back
you, Peter.
to you.
Appreciate it. All right. So in the time we have left, about 20 minutes, first we're going to have Chris come up, and he talked about some real-world scenarios that they explored, and it involves some of these companies. So Chris is quickly going to take us through 2 of those scenarios, and then Dan is going to take us through making sense of all of this. So, Chris?
So William Gibson said that the future is already here. It's just not well distributed. And so when we think about these scenarios, what we're really talking about is not some sort of crazy world in the future that doesn't already exist. Everything we're talking about already exists today. And when you go back to what Peter talked about with regards to Kodak, Kodak could see all the disruption going on. They had invented and held the patents for much of the digital ecosystem that had emerged in photography. The problem was Kodak didn't realize what business they were in. They thought they were in the business of selling paper to share memories, when in reality they should have been in the business of just sharing memories, and they could care less about the medium through which it was shared. And if they were focused on sharing memories rather than sharing paper or selling paper, they could have had a very different outcome. So we want to share with you a couple of headlines from 2020. SWIFT delivers real-time retail domestic payments in the United States. So let me read you a couple of quotes from this press release. SWIFT announced plans to deploy its real-time domestic payment platform in the United States. SWIFT domestic payment platform allows domestic retail payments to be made instantly between financial institutions and their customers' accounts. SWIFT already provides this platform in Australia, a truth today, Hong Kong, New Zealand, as in talks to do the same in the United Kingdom and South Africa. SWIFT's real-time payment platform uses innovative peer-to-peer technologies that developed by reusing and reconfiguring SWIFT's components already deployed in proven market infrastructure projects. To Peter's point about capabilities and how you repurpose those capabilities. And built on SWIFT's interfaces to drive efficiencies for customers who merely need a cell phone or email address to access that platform. They don't need a bank account necessarily, they just need an email or a cell phone. The new market continues SWIFT's strategic moves from its traditional roots of messaging to support the correspondent banking market, which now only represents less than 10% of its business. SWIFT sees its new retail and commercial payment platforms representing about 1/3 of its business, with the rest coming from consulting services that support compliance and treasury and liquidity management. When the US system comes online in 2021, SWIFT will see 1 of every 3 retail and corporate payments in the world crossing its platform. The trend in retail payments is having a profound impact on payment ecosystems and is highly relevant to SWIFT's core business, says Gottfried Librand, the CEO of SWIFT. The SWIFT instant retail payment solution, banks can leverage their existing SWIFT infrastructure, resulting in cost-effective solutions with world-class efficiency. Okay? So anyways, that's one future scenario. And that future scenario is based upon things that are already taking place. We have another future scenario which ties more to what we just did in the previous round. This is the role that we see these digital disruptors playing. It's interesting to note that when you look at these 3 digital disruptors, each of them have customer bases that are measured in the hundreds of millions of customers. When we look at the largest banks, they've got customers around the 25 million or so. And so what we're talking about is digital companies that at their core are focused on innovating digitally with customer bases where they have direct contact that are multiples the size of the current market. The press release that we came up with actually looked at the emergence of Microsoft into this market, where Microsoft is a latecomer to the market, where these 3 companies here already control 75% of all retail as well as small to medium-sized business transactions. And so we see a world now in which these digital disruptors are able to leverage existing relationships with hundreds of millions of customers where they already have their credit card, they're already now providing payment solutions, leveraging that up, going from consumer now to small businesses, from small business to medium-sized businesses, and eventually to corporate and commercial customers by leveraging their consumer core. And finally, when we look at how this is transforming the marketplace, we see that increasingly banks are going to have to see these digital disruptors as becoming meaningful players in the marketplace because they're going to do, as Hayden and as Peter talked about, start moving horizontally into these horizontal markets to leverage their capabilities and customer relationships.
All right, Chris, thank you. So if we could bring those companies back up that we looked at earlier, and we're going to have Dan talk about that horizontal expansion. We talked about those single product companies who went deep, but we think the winners are going to be the ones that go wide. So Dan, I'll let you summarize this.
All right. So I think, you know, we're here at Sibos, and everybody represents some part of the ecosystem of the financial world. Particularly, obviously, payments is a big topic here at Sibos. And I think one of the things that happens at the moment with the whole fintech revolution, and particularly the general business press getting really, really excited about stuff that they really, really don't understand as a general rule, I think one of the things that happens is even those people in the industry who really do know what they're talking about tend to confuse and conflate and confound themselves with equivalency where it doesn't exist. So, you know, everybody gets excited about Apple Pay. And I think there are lots of reasons to get excited. As Chris said, Apple has hundreds of millions of customers. They have, I think the number is about 400 million credit card, debit cards on file. That's certainly massively sufficient as critical mass to begin to create a payment ecosystem. But the funny thing about Apple Pay is that actually it's about this deep. The payment rails that Apple Pay runs on are the credit card and debit card rails which emerged in the 60s and 70s. It's actually not all that interesting from a technical perspective. The other dirty secret, of course, is that Apple runs the largest implementation of SAP in the world to run iTunes, which also ain't necessarily super innovative. But what Apple's brilliant at is the user experience and the user interface layer. And so it kind of creates something seemingly quite disruptive and interesting on a legacy infrastructure. So I think what's useful is to go and break what we see here down into where it fits in the stack, into the front, in the middle, and the back. Because obviously in banks, we spend lots of time talking about the front office and the middle office and the back office. And obviously, you know, we could have debates over glasses of adult beverages on precisely where everybody should fit on this mapping. But let's go ahead and break that down. So here's an attempt to kind of mix this up a little bit and show where we have integrators, where we've got back-end infrastructure, where we have middle office, where we have end user experience at the front end. And I think it's really important to think about it in this way. The question, though, is what happens if we really blow this up? We're supposed to be talking about the future. We're supposed to be getting to the next step here. This is Innotribe, and we're talking about disruption. So what happens if we blow it up? We got a little explosion. There we go. So what happens if we go from economies of scale to economies of scope? So it's not just a question of size, but it's a question of where in the stack, where in the ecosystem a company touches or a service touches. From enabling transactions to enabling commerce, Peter is right, I think, there you are. Peter is right to bring up, I made this comment, and I was thinking here, it is frighteningly, it was 5 years ago at Sibos, talked about this idea of the digital strip stream, and I was critical of the banks for saying that the banks were focused just on the payment itself. A bit of value has to go from A to B, and that companies like Google and Apple were as interested in the payment that isn't made as they are with the payment that is made. So if you think about Google, they know, your wife may not know, but they know that you're searching for that new car. And that, whenever you get a second, you take a look at it and you read reviews about it and you look at pictures and you configure and see what it looks like in different colors. And whether you decide to hit the bid and actually buy the car or not, because Google probably isn't involved, certainly 5 years ago, wasn't involved in actually enabling the payment. Whether they're involved in the final consummation of the purchase or not, they're measuring your intention during that entire journey. And that intention is monetizable for Google because they sell advertising based around what you care about. And its selection and choice is just as valuable to them as the payment, where obviously it's a higher value payment. Maybe a bank makes more, but actually, payments are dollars at best or cents more often in terms of value. Enabling commerce means that we look at the whole stream and the whole experience. Well, from tactics to strategy, I think at some level kind of obvious, but I think also critical. So much of what we get mired in financial services, particularly in payments, and frankly, a lot at Sibos, where we get deep into, MT202 COV, and we get into new ISO standards, and we get into all the minutia and the tactics of surviving regulatory change, of surviving technology squeezes and hiring freezes and other things that rhyme with ease, maybe. That's part of what happens here. And we lose the strategy. We lose the piece about how do you take your customer and deliver commerce and deliver a surrounding experience that helps them sell better to their end customers. From UX to behavior. I think this is fundamental. If we're really honest with ourselves, there are probably a lot of banks who still need to embrace user experience. I think the point that Chris made is one, frankly, that I've also made for a long time as well, which I think is true, is that the retail consumer experience, which is set by Apple and which is set by Amazon, of what it means to go through a process, that experience is so rich and so simple and so easy. A point I've thought about for a long time, I think Amazon has something around 100 million retail customers. And if you think about what the Amazon website does, it's actually a very complex, very richly functional order management system. How different is it? And in fact, I would argue in most cases, it's more functionally robust and more functionally rich than most operational back office systems that exist in payments departments around banks. Yet I bet when your operations staff onboards a new employee, they train that poor bastard for weeks to learn how to use those terrible systems with green screens and PDP-11 and IBM 360 Def that runs it in the back end. Amazon has 100 million customers using a far more complex system, and not once, not ever, nowhere in the world has anyone ever been trained on how to use Amazon, right? That's astounding. So the next step, of course, is behavior, right? And so you could argue that I'm not sure the banks have got here, but they have to get to behavior as well, which is a much more all-encompassing view of how clients interact, how customers interact with what you deliver. And lastly, launch and learn. I think this is something which I'm almost loath to bring up on this stage because it's so difficult for banks. We live, and we're sitting here in, essentially in the Swift stand. And the culture of Swift is about 5 nines. It's about 5 nines, right? This is, in many ways, it's hard to argue that we don't want that because Swift is dealing with money. In the same way that electrical utilities deal with the power that runs the whole economy or the water that makes cities possible. So you don't necessarily want your water company to have a minimum viable product and then have no water come out of the tap, or have poisonous water come out of the tap and say, oops, wait, sorry, but we were just in beta. So I think we all understand why in financial services it's tough. But what's clear from a number of the names that we see up here is that they are doing launch and learn. They are doing small prototypes. They are doing small pilots, and they're learning what works, and they're learning what doesn't, and they're building first. They're getting reaction, they're getting response, they're iterating, and they're fixing and building again. The way banks build is a multi-month and often multi-year evaluation and planning and design cycle. And then, when you get to the end of the process, 18 months hence, after you've had your IT budget cut 3 times on the way to the starting gate, and you finally get live and you actually realize that now the product's not so relevant anymore, that's really expensive. If you could launch and learn, you get to a different place. So let's sum this up here a little bit. I think one of the major points that we need to take away is that innovation is happening and disruption is happening at every single layer of the stack. It's happening in the back end, it's happening in the middle, and it's happening in the front. And there's a lot of value, I think, in trying to dig deep into where in the stack you're getting excited about something. Is this a front-end innovation? Not to dismiss user experience, because obviously, in many ways, is an Apple iPhone functionally any different from a Samsung iPhone? No. But does Apple control 97% of all smartphone profits globally? So HTC and Huawei and Samsung, they collectively share 3% of profit at the end of 2014. And mostly that's about user experience and marketing and brand, but mostly user experience. So I wouldn't dismiss it, but it's really important to understand at what level of the stack you're working. And I would say, coming from Earthport, one of the things that we get very excited about is that we're not a shiny app that's in the last mile or the last, it's often more like the last half centimeter pressed against your ear that we get excited about. At Earthport, we're working in the guts. We're working in the fundamental plumbing about how money moves. And I think that's an exciting place to be because everybody is kind of downstream of what we work on. So I think that's something you should think about, right? Which is, where are you in the stack? The second piece is that it's very unlikely, given the pace of change, given the level of disruption that's now coming to this market, it's very unlikely that any single player is going to own the complete disrupted solution front to back, front to middle to back. It's very unlikely. And so what that's moving to is a world of best-of-breed selection, of best-of-breed technology. Again, it's hackneyed, and I apologize for beating a dead horse with the Apple example, but they are so rich. The Apple guys, they don't manufacture a single component in this phone. And what's more impressive is they don't even screw the damn thing together. That's all outsourced. And yet, are they any less of a phone company as a result? Does anybody take Apple less seriously because they don't manufacture microphones? No. They do a genius job in architecture and design, a genius job in marketing and user experience creation, and a fantastic job in procurement and logistics to make sure the phones get delivered. Why can't banks build that way? Why can't banks understand that it's unlikely that they themselves, or any single vendor that's out there, is going to give you the beautiful bank in the box that does trade and cash and security settlement and dashboarding and mobile apps? It's just highly unlikely that someone's going to have that richness of product that gets you where you need to be. And I think the last piece here is that as we look at the front and the middle and the back, they're not all changing at the same pace. They're not all changing at the same speed. And that's okay. They don't have to, right? It's not essential that they do. And if you get rid of monolithic thinking about how architecture of banking services are built, And if we don't say, look, we're going to go from, I won't name names, but we're going to go from this monolithic bank in a box to somebody else's monolithic bank in the box, where we expect to spend 624 million euros and 8 years to implement, and we instead recognize that we're going to pick pieces at various levels in the stack which are fit for purpose and which are ready for you, that solve a problem you have today, which is cost effective and that you're ready for, it's perfectly acceptable for you to do work on your front end, leaving some of the old legacy stuff running in the back, because the front is what maybe affects the customers first. And then when you realize the front end can no longer be enabled by the capabilities you have in the back, you can focus your attention on the plumbing. And that's an acceptable strategy, and actually one which is deeply pragmatic and also deeply disruptive. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's give all these guys a round of applause. And I think we have just enough time for each of you, just for a closing thought. You heard the winners and losers picked. You heard from each other. Is there a message that you guys would give the audience as they sort of look out over the 5 years that they should carry forward? And Chris, can we start with you? Maybe just a closing thought?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, this has been brought up in several sessions today, is around business model innovation. That we spend a lot of time talking about technology, but it's not about the technology. The technology is actually pretty simple. It's the business model that's so difficult to change, and that's because culture is so difficult to change. And the challenge for all these large organizations is, how do they enable a culture that enables you to do real launches and to try things and to figure out what works and to then iterate as quickly as the market is changing.
Great. Peter, what about you?
I don't think it's business model innovation. It's about business process innovation, and changing processes is probably one of the hardest things to do. If you want to compete with some of the players, especially the Alibabas, etc., on this chart, then it's about process innovation. It's not model innovation. And there was something in the explosion slide that I really want to articulate, or to give my color to it, which is the line from tactics to strategy. So I think having a sandbox is tactics. Having an open innovation model is tactics. Having a startup competition is tactics. Having conversations with startups is tactics. What is strategy is to decide which are the real options you want to pursue, and then go the whole end, not just in the sandbox, because the whole problem of the sandbox, you never get out of the sandbox. My experience is that the biggest challenge in innovation is to get out of the sandbox. Yeah. Usually, it's very easy to do minimum value proposition and iterate, and everybody has read the Lean Startup book, etc. And at the end, you have a really awesome prototype. The challenge then is, how do you give it back to the core? That's the real challenge. And the problem is really because we polarize core and non-core, and you have to go the whole track in exploring real-world options together with multidisciplinary teams, marketing, IT, pricing, etc. And you go all the way along from initial ideation to getting it in bloody production. It's about shipping products, not about experimenting.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Dan, final thoughts.
So, I don't disagree with what you said, Peter. I think that is a big challenge. I think for me, I think there's a little bit of a panic going on right now in financial services, which I'm unfortunately old enough to remember .com 1.0 in financial services, when there was also similarly a panic, when there was a sense that two kids in San Francisco who were smoking pot in their garage were going to invent something that put Citibank out of business tomorrow. And it didn't happen, and it isn't going to happen now either. And so I think, is there disruption happening? Is there real change happening? Absolutely there is. But pragmatic disruption is absolutely fine. The key is to be real. The key is to deliver something that actually makes a change, and not to fool yourself that having a lab, which is having happy conversations and guys with tattoos that you now employ on the payroll, that somehow you're getting anything done as a result. Pick something small, pick something real, pick something that's a pain point for a customer, and drive it through until it delivers value.
Fantastic. All right, again, if we could thank Chris, Peter, who's filling in for Hayden, and Dan Marovitz. Great job, guys. All right, I've got a little bit of housekeeping here and some news. So first of all, Chris will be just outside here to the left signing copies of his book. So if you want to challenge his thinking or talk to him more, he'll be out there signing copies of his new book. Also, Hayden has offered digital copies of his book. I can carry the postcard. Your book didn't fit in my pocket. But you can also pick up a postcard. There's a QR reader, and you can download a free copy of Shift, which is excellent. I highly encourage that. So those will be just out to the left when you leave. Two other things. As great as the voting devices are, we need to use them again for other sessions. Please leave those behind, as well as the templates that you filled out. We'd love to see who you really picked, but weren't willing to say. Last thing, when you go out, please rate the session. It is very informative to us if you found this session useful. So there will be a little old school voting panel for you to vote on when you leave to rate the session. And finally, we'll be back here tomorrow morning at 9:15. Chris will be here to recap this entire day, and we'll kick off a whole day on what does society want. So thank you all for attending today, and we'll see you tomorrow.